What we see here might appear to be nothing more than a guy shooting different rifles, but something is happening that might not be immediately obvious. Every time the rifle stock hits this guy's shoulder, he is getting off an aimed shot in about 1/2 a second or slightly longer. That's not very interesting by itself, but the shooter is beginning his shots with his rifle near his waist. He is not starting the shot with the rifle butt against his shoulder, which is a typical tactical style stance. If you are a hunter, particularly in the forests of the eastern United States or Canada, you might face a situation when you need to make the kind of shots this guy is. We are going to talk in detail about what this guy is doing and show you how to do it. We should emphasize this shooter is using the iron sights on these guns. He isn't doing anything wild or reckless because the sights are lined up on the target when he shoots. This shooter does not need more time to aim. The rifle is aimed at the target as soon as the buttstock hits the shooter's shoulder. Any corrections needed are very, very tiny. We should point out, for those who need to know, hunters don't stand around with their rifle butts on their shoulders non-stop in the long hours they are hunting. I've seen many hunters, and I've never seen one do it. The trophy of a lifetime might emerge close by from the trees in front of a hunter in the forest, and could do so silently. When that happens, the hunter might have only 2 seconds to make a scoring hit, and if he misses, he might not get a second shot. If a deer runs or even walks within 20 yards of you, things can happen fast. This is a fairly short-range method, and short range is when you would need it. If a deer is 70 yards away, he is less likely to see you. If, on the other hand, you are on the ground and the deer is 18 yards away, odds are much higher the deer will see you. Now, I'm sure that in the history of the United States, millions of hunters and marksmen have known how to shoot this way. But I have never seen this aiming method described in detail anywhere. And even if it was, I want to throw in my 2 cents worth because this is a skill that can be learned. You don't even have to fire a shot to learn it. You can learn how to do this by practicing with an unloaded gun. And once you do learn how, this kind of shooting is no big deal at all. We will discuss the correct steps in the process. We will discuss the need to minimize or eliminate needless movement. We'll talk about how the choice of a rifle affects the procedure. We'll talk about how optics can help and what to do if the animal is running. My advice is to learn this aiming process in 2 stages. The first stage will be to learn how to line up the sights when the stock hits the shoulder. If you are using an optic, that should not be too difficult, but there's also the second stage. The second stage will be how to line up the sights on the target simultaneous with the shouldering movement. Now we come to the meat of the matter. The basic move of our shooter's technique is to place the stock on the shoulder and the cheek on the stock simultaneously. They both happen at the same instant. This is the number 1 fundamental step to eliminate all wasted time and wasted movement in order to shoot this way. By comparison, it's routine to first shoulder the stock of the gun and then place the cheek on the stock second. If we do that, it consumes a great deal of time and it slows everything way down. If we have a deer close at hand and we're standing there like many hunters do with the gun down near our waist, it also will consume time if we place the stock on our shoulder before we raise the rifle. If we do that, it will slow the process down considerably. Another thing to avoid is placing the stock in the wrong position on the shoulder and then sliding it into the correct position. The goal is to immediately plant the stock where it belongs on the shoulder. We need to explain a couple of things for any novices who might be watching this. There are a couple of very fundamental elements of rifle shooting form that should not be ignored. For one, we raise our shoulders to bring the sights of the gun up to eye level or close to it. Additionally, we also rest our cheek on the gun stock. You are going to find the best shots with the rifle always do both of these things. If we don't do them, the alternative is to weave our head back and forth, up and down, trying to get the sights in our line of vision, a process that could take 10 seconds or longer. If anybody listening is shooting a rifle this way, my advice is to learn to stop doing it immediately and to get some good instruction. When we look again at our shooter, we see that his head is always at the correct angle as he begins the movement to aim. We see that our shooter, who is right-handed, never turns his head to the right to line his eye up with the sights. Instead, his head is already at the correct angle. He is right-handed and his head is turned to the right slightly before he raises the rifle. Now, it's certainly true that when you are hunting, you might not be allowed the luxury of avoiding that kind of a turn. I think the best way to characterize it is that having the head in the correct position as you begin to raise the gun is certainly the ideal option if it is available. And certainly when we are practicing this technique, that is the stance I would advise, because it helps develop your muscle memory, and muscle memory is important. The question is, how much to the right should a right-handed shooter turn his or her head? And the answer is not much. Another part of the answer is the positioning of the head does not have to be a terribly precise movement. How far to turn the head can vary a little bit in either direction, and the process will still work. Another thing on our side is that placing the cheek on the stock by itself will tend to ensure a correct head position. If, for whatever reason, the head has to be turned, make it part of the overall movement, like this. As I indicated earlier, another element in this entire process is muscle memory, which leads us to having the eye lined up with the sights the instant the gun is shouldered. If you already can put your cheek on the stock and line up the sights without having to weave your head back and forth, it's muscle memory that helps you do that, and it's practice that creates muscle memory. So, how do we practice the first stage of this aiming process? The first thing I would recommend doing is practicing this only with your hunting rifle, because the process will become far more consistent if you do this with only one gun. Our shooter in the footage is using 4 different rifles, and the truth be told, his form is a little on the sloppy side. By comparison, if we use the same rifle all the time for this procedure, it's possible to make these kinds of shots about 1/4 of a second faster than the guy in our footage. And since the goal of this process in the first place is to get your deer, what better rifle to practice with than your deer gun? Again, our shooter is using 4 different guns, and the main idea behind this was to show that different configurations of the firearm are no impediment to using the rapid aiming process. One of the guns he's using, a Mauser K98, definitely could be a deer gun, and 2 other rifles he is using also could be deer guns, depending on the caliber. If the Ruger was a Mini 30, that's enough for a deer, and if the AR was, for example, a 300 Blackout, that also could take a deer. Again, I would like to emphasize, my experience tells me it is never necessary to fire the rifle when practicing this technique. And I mean never ever necessary. And it's certainly not necessary when we are in the first phase of this learning process, which is what we're talking about. Not only that, but in my experience, there's no need to even pull the trigger while practicing this. No need at all. I say this because if you are even a halfway decent shot, you already know how to pull a trigger. It's the rapid aiming you need to get together. They're 2 separate events. Now we talk about what I do when I practice the first stage of this process. I do not use a loaded gun. I have the safety on. Again, there's no need to fire the thing, and if you're going to imitate what I do, I hope you pay strict attention to making sure the gun is empty. What I do is I face a white or light colored blank wall. I shoulder the gun and weld my cheek to the stock all in one motion. If you try this in any environment, and you aren't immediately looking at the sights lined up, obviously that's the part you have to work on. You'll have to find the proper position of your head and the proper cheek weld to accomplish this. If it's part of the overall movement, there is no harm to lowering the head slightly to place the cheek on the stock. Try to avoid slamming the rifle stock against your shoulder with a violent movement. If you do that, you'll knock the gun out of line. You do not want that. Another thing you want to avoid is raising the rifle so high that you have to lower the muzzle to line the sights up with your eye. This clip shows a slight example of that. The shooter is lowering the muzzle to bring the sights onto target. That is one more thing that will waste time. This will not necessarily prevent a quick shot, but the shot could be quicker if this movement is avoided. Every tiny wasted movement creates a small delay. Now, there's no way I can predict how quickly you can get this aiming process together. It might take 5 minutes and it might take 3 months. If the gun is long and heavy, probably the process is going to take longer than if we are using a short, lighter gun. But you absolutely have to practice this. Nothing will happen if you don't practice. When you do get this part of it together, you just might notice that when the sights are lined up, they are lined up exactly with the spot you were looking at. If that sounds like a surprise, it shouldn't be. More than 400 years ago in England, archers, that is to say guys who shot bows and arrows, were advised to concentrate their vision on a tiny spot to be hit because, and I am quoting here, every part of the body will do whatever the eye commands. So when I practice the second stage of the process, I tape a little piece of paper on my blank wall. I stare at it hard. I do everything in one movement. And I keep practicing until the sights are consistently landing on that piece of paper. If your rifle has a scope that won't turn down lower than 3 power or 4 power, it might mean you cannot aim this way with any consistency at close range. This might be a risk because if magnification of the scope is too high, it might not give you the adequate field of view you need to quickly determine you are indeed aimed at your target. If, on the other hand, you have a scope that will turn down to 1.5 power or 2 power, you should be okay. The shooter in the footage used 2 rifles with rear peep sights, and he also used 2 rifles that have open or V-shaped rear sights. Both can work. Some shooters might decide an open rear sight lets them confirm the sights are on target a fraction of a second faster than a rear peep sight. And if that happens, the reason would be that the open rear sight tends to allow more of the target to be visible compared to many peep sights. I think it's kind of unfortunate that many modern hunting rifles have no iron sights whatsoever. I'm sure they do this for economics and so forth, but that means the topic of optics is very pertinent to this conversation. A red dot sight is a fine idea if you are able to mount one on your gun. If a red dot scope has a dot of about 3 MOA or even smaller, it certainly is usable at longer ranges. Here we see a target using a red dot firing an AR-15 and it made a 1-inch group at 100 yards. It's also probably true that most hunters, if they want an optic, they're going to use a magnified scope. I probably have to say that would be my first choice under most circumstances if the scope can be turned down to at least 2 power. Let's take a look at what some of these sights will do for us when we're standing 20 yards from this sign. Here is this sign being viewed with iron sights from 20 yards. Here again is the same sign, again from 20 yards, being viewed with a red dot scope. And here is that same sign, also at 20 yards, yet again, viewed with a scope set at about 2 power. You can decide for yourself, but I think this kind of emphasizes the value of a magnified scope. It also does not necessarily mean that I would hesitate to use iron sights if I'm hunting in a forest. I would not hesitate at all. The shooter in the video got off his fastest shots with a .22 Marlin Papoose, and it has an open rear sight. The Marlin sights have been painted to resemble these sights on a Remington 870 slug barrel, and this barrel is a good choice for this kind of shooting. Another thing that makes the Marlin fast is the fact that it weighs only 3 pounds. A German Mauser K98, on the other hand, weighs about 8 pounds, and it slowed the shooter down by about 2/10 of a second. A Remington 870 weighs about 6 pounds and is a fine choice. The shooter was reasonably quick with this 6-pound Mini 14. Another fine choice for this kind of shooting is the Model 94 Winchester. It weighs a little over 6 pounds and has the kind of iron sights we're talking about. A Marlin 336, a similar gun, weighs about 7 pounds. Some modern bolt actions are pretty light. A Ruger American will weigh no more than about 6.5 pounds without an optic. I earlier mentioned running shots. What does a shooter normally do for a running shot? He turns at the waist so he doesn't disturb his shoulders or head, and so the sights stay lined up with his eye. All that would remain the same if he shoulders the gun with our quick aiming method. If a deer is 20 yards away or thereabouts from a person when the deer notices that person, all kinds of different things can happen. For example, the deer might suddenly leap about 15 or 20 feet in the flash of an eye, or the deer may lower itself to the ground a little bit and dig in before it takes off running. It could immediately do a complete 180 turn. So that it's very difficult to predict exactly what a deer is going to do when it gets close to you. The only thing I can say with any certainty is stay loose and stay on your toes. That is it. I thank you for watching, and I wish you good hunting.